So for today's gospel, I've chosen a passage from Luke, which talks about Jesus sending out the 72. And for me, I like to play around with numbers. It's a kind of a synchronicity for me, because he had first sent out 12 and then later 72. When I was ordained to be a missionary priest, I was ordained as one of 12 priests. And I began my missionary career in 1972. So I feel like, in some sense, when he said he sent out another 72, I could change it to say, and in 72, he sent out another bunch of 12. So here's the reading from Luke. After this, the Lord appointed 72 others and sent them 2 by 2 ahead of him to every town and every place he was about to go himself. He told them, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. Go, I am sending you out like lambs among wolves. Do not take a purse or bag or sandals, and do not greet anyone on the road. When you enter a house, first say, 'Shalom, peace to this house.' If someone who promotes peace is there, your peace will rest on them. If not, it will return to you. Stay there eating and drinking whatever they give you, because the worker deserves his wages. Do not move from house to house. When you enter a town and are welcomed, eat what they offer you. Heal the sick who are there and tell them the kingdom of God has drawn near to you." Words inspired by God. So today is an anniversary for me. On the 8th of November in 1972, I began my missionary career in Kenya, landed in Jomo Kenyatta Airport in Nairobi in Kenya, and fell in love with Kenya immediately. It was the fulfillment of a childhood dream. As a child, I knew I wanted to be a priest, and I knew I wanted to be a priest working as a missionary in some part of Africa. And so after finishing high school, I spent 8 years studying theology, philosophy, scripture, linguistics, community development, as well as a degree in mathematics and physics. And then I spent 14 of the best years of my life working among the Kalenjin people of Kenya in many, many different kinds of functions. As a priest, obviously. For a few years, I was a headmaster of a high school, Kipchimchim Harambe High School. I was involved in community-based healthcare with the Medical Missionaries of Mary. I was involved a lot with famine relief. And I was a kind of a self-taught architect who designed and built schools, convents, rectories, hospitals, and churches over 14 years. And towards the end of that period in 1983, I wrote my first book, and I wrote it in Kiswahili, and I called it Ukweli ni Nini, What Does Truth Mean? And it was a book commissioned by the Diocese of Nakuru, a kind of a catechism. But I chose to write the catechism in a story form, as a story where a Christ child visits a village in Kenya and interacts with all the children in the village. And for a period of several days, is fielding questions and giving teachings to them. And in a sense, it was 1983. It was a kind of a compendium of my own spirituality and my own understanding of my Catholic faith at that stage. Since then, I've continued to examine my faith. I've continued to prune it, to graft on new branches, because I wanted to be talking about a world tree, not merely a sectarian shrub. So recently, I just completed another book called Setting God Free. Hopefully, it'll be published in 2021. And it's a kind of an updated version of where my journey spiritually has taken me. I'm trying to separate cultural faith from faith in the ineffable source. I'm trying to separate love-based mysticism from merely fear-based fundamentalism. And today, then, for a little bit, I want to try to go through some of that, some of the changes that have happened in my own lifetime, some of the places I have gone in my theology and in my thinking. And so I want to weave a kind of a triple Celtic knot. The tree is very, very sacred in Celtic tradition. And it's a knot consisting of science, psychology, and spirituality. And as I do this, I just want to talk about, some of my own thinking. And there have been a few events in my life in Kenya and since then, which have fairly radically altered my understanding of what God is and what true faith is about. And one of those I just mentioned as I began, and it happened on Good Friday in 1990. I was in Palo Alto by then, and I was celebrating Good Friday in St. Anne's Church in Palo Alto. And about a year beforehand, I had befriended a woman called Arlen Brownstein, who was my soulmate, and whom I'm very, very close still. And she decided to bring her mother to Mass. Now, Arlen obviously is Jewish, her mother is Jewish, and her mother was visiting from Florida. And I'm standing there on the altar in full priestly robes. And the gospel that day, the gospel, where Jesus is on trial. And allegedly, Pilate wants to release him because he doesn't find any sin in him. And the mob shout out, crucify him, crucify him. And Pilate says, I'm washing my hands of the blood of this innocent man. And the crowd shout out, his blood be upon us and upon our children. And I suddenly realized, as I'm standing at the altar, I'm looking at these two Jewish women, particularly Arlen's mother, Annie, because Annie's mother had fled Russia about way back in the early 1920s, about 2 weeks before her entire family was wiped out in a pogrom on Good Friday because they were Jewish, because they had crucified Jesus. And I'm standing there on the altar, and I'm watching these two Jewish women listen to this phrase, his blood be upon us and upon our children. And I think back to the 2,000 years in which Christianity has visited blood on these people. And it was one of the huge turning points in my own theology. I could never again go back to that passage and read it and think that that's actually what really happened. So events like that have significantly impacted how I look at God and how I look at spirituality. And so with that kind of understanding, I have continued to, on a regular basis, prune my thinking and graft new spiritual ideas onto my thinking, so that, as I say, I want to try to believe in a world tree, Etz Chaim, tree of life, rather than a mere sectarian shrub called Christianity or Roman Catholicism. And so just today in this homily for a few moments, I want to run just 3 ideas by you where I have grown my thinking, or at least changed my thinking. And the first one is the notion of the Trinity. And the second one will be the notion of the origins of life. And then thirdly, our journey back to God. So they're the 3 things I'll touch upon this morning. So I want to look at where I am at the moment with the notion of the Holy Trinity. And if we grew up Catholic, we tend to think that Catholicism or Christianity is the only religion that has a notion of a trinity of persons. And we tend to think that the Trinity consists of a first person, a second person, a third person, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. Now, what we forget, of course, is that when this was first defined by the Church Fathers in the 3rd and 4th centuries, the word they used in Greek was prosopon, and it got translated into Latin as persona. Prosopon means a mask. It was the mask that an actor would wear coming on stage in order to alert the audience as to what kind of character he was about to portray. Was it a comic character or a sad character? And so prosopon was simply the mask that the actor wore in order to play a role. When it got translated into Latin, it was translated as persona. Per means through, and sona means sound. So that through which you made a sound. So you had holes for the eyes, and you had holes for the mouth, and you spoke through it. So the word persona, from which we get personality and person, and the 3 persons of the Trinity, they give the false impression that there are 3 dudes sitting in heaven who are separate, individuals, 3 persons. It doesn't mean that. It simply means that as we wrestle with the ineffable, we try to put masks on God. We try to figure out different aspects of how we experience the divine. And so the model we were brought up in was there's a Father, there's a Son, and there's a Holy Spirit. And the second person, the Son, incarnated as Jesus of Nazareth. Now, long before Christianity, there was this notion in Hinduism. They have 2 versions of it. The first version was that God is Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. So Brahma is the creative aspect of God, and Vishnu is the sustaining, that which keeps life going, And Shiva is that which reconfigures life on a regular basis and therefore is the agent of evolution. Hinduism has another idea that they call Sat, Chit, Ananda. And Sat literally means being. Chit means, awareness or knowledge or knowing. And Ananda means bliss. So there were the notions of Trinity that you find in Hinduism. And even in Buddhism, there's a notion of Trinity. One of the great mantras in Buddhism is Saranam, Buddham Saranam Gacchami, Dharmam Saranam Gacchami, Sangam Saranam Gacchami. I take refuge in the Buddha as the source. I take refuge in the Dharma, the teaching. I take refuge in the Sangha, which is the community. So you get this Trinitarian formula in many, many different religious traditions, even more so than the ones I've just mentioned. Now, as I've come to think about it over the years, because I realize that God is an ineffable transcendent mystery whom we can experience, but about whom we can only speak in parables, as did Jesus today in another reading. And so here's my unwrapping of the notion from where I stand right now. When I think of the Father, Son, and Spirit, the first person, the second person, the third person, I think of the first person as pure, contentless consciousness, awareness itself, or consciousness itself. The second person I think of as self-awareness or self-consciousness. So initially, there's just contentless consciousness. And then there's a self-awareness. And then thirdly, there's a self-acceptance or a self-love. And that's the spirit in a sense. And when you put these three facets together, and they're indivisible, it's not like there's a time lag between the contentless consciousness and then the self-awareness and then the self-love. Time didn't exist. So it's a dance. And the totality of these three facets I would call source. So the contentless consciousness, the self-aware aspect of it, and the self-love aspect of it, that for me is what I understand by the Trinity. Everything else we say about the Trinity is metaphor and parable. And we have to deal with metaphor and parable because we're human beings with these tiny little laptops. But when we really go into a mystical understanding, it's a radically different, model. So that's the first thing I would say about my understanding of what Trinity means to me. Building on that then, I want to look at what I consider the origin and the evolution of life. So at some stage, this transcendent mystery, which we can experience, but which we cannot articulate, it chooses to become immanent, to be visible or sensible to us. And so in some senses, it's as if God, the ineffable unity, wants to experience otherness. And it's a game that God plays. Hinduism will call it the game of Laila. And the phrase I've used for it is that God, fractures into bite-sized pieces, that everything that exists is a bite-sized piece of God, that everything that exists is the word of God made flesh. The Kabbalah in Judaism has this beautiful phrase, it's got nitzutzim. Nitzutzim are the sparks of the divinity, the way in which this original unit of light just fractured itself into billions of little sparks. And those would maybe we would call souls. If I were to use kind of scientific language, I would say that God chose to represent herself as holographic fractals. Now, a hologram, you realize, a hologram is something where if you take any piece of it, you take a holographic photograph and you tear off a corner of it, the totality of the image is contained even in the corner of it. So every part of it contains the totality of itself. And for me, in some senses, that's the ultimate form of entanglement, the entanglement of which I spoke last week, looking at the work of Edgar Mitchell and John Bell, the Irish physicist. So we are holographic fractals, and fractals are simply patterns that occur, at an infinite number of scales. Like if you were to start with the nucleus of an atom and electrons spinning around it, and then you go bump up to a planet with moons spinning around it, and then a sun with planets spinning around it, and then a galaxy with a black hole in the center and solar systems spinning around it, and then the galaxy itself spinning around a mega black hole somewhere in our cosmos, and this cosmos spinning about multiple other cosmoses out there. And so the holographic fractals represent the shards of divinity that we understand as life itself. So in some senses, in order to experience that which is other, which is the game that God plays, she has to create that which is not her. And I'm using air quotes, obviously, when I said that which is not her, because there is only the divine. Now, it's not really accurate to say then that God creates, ex nihilo. Rather, I believe that God does emanatio ab Deo rather than creatio ex nihilo. Creatio ex nihilo means creating out of nothing. Emanatio ab Deo means that which emanates from a pre-existing God. And so the image I've used many times is that of a flower. In the field where the cabin used to be before it got burned down, every spring there would just be profusion of daffodils, the whole hillside covered in daffodils. And I'd be amazed that something that lay hidden for 10 months of the year, a little bulb hidden underground, it didn't create a stalk. And for me, daffodils are some of the most elegant flowers because there's this really elegant, straight spined shaft, the stalk. Then at some stage, it gives birth to a yellow flower. Now, the yellow flower was not created by the stalk, and the stalk was not created by the bulb. Both the stalk and the flower are emanations of the pre-existing bulb. They've always been there, potentially there, they're just manifesting. So in some senses, there is no such thing as creation, I believe. There's only emanation or manifestation from the unity consciousness, which is the divine. I'd make the claim, in fact, and it may sound really silly, that parents do not make a baby. I do not believe that parents make a baby. I believe that parents manifest a baby from the material of their bodies and from the contract of three souls. And so what arrives, out of the womb is the result just of the materiality of the two parents and the contract of the soul. But it's a manifestation of previously existing matter, and it's a manifestation of previously existing soul contracts. So in that sense, parents don't make a baby, parents manifest a child. Now, I think then, even though I continue to use the word creation here, I'm really talking about manifestation all through. So creation then for me, I think, as God decided to play this game, what were the modalities? How did she go about doing it? And I think she created a dance between light and logos. Creation then, in fact, is this dance between light and logos. And light is the basis of all matter. All matter is simply frozen light. I told you last week that it's a fact that there's more information beamed onto planet Earth in 5 minutes of sunlight than exists in all of the libraries and all of the archives on planet Earth right now. So sunlight is constantly beaming data and information onto our planet. And for me, that is the real driver of evolution. Much more so than it's not just spontaneous generation, and it's not just kind of random mutation. There is an extraordinary light-filled designer beaming information to upgrade all life forms on planet Earth. And so in some senses, that's kind of one leg of the dance. The other leg of the dance is the logos, our sound in a sense. That which gives form, that which creates species, or gives us morphology, or gives us taxonomy, that's logos, our sound. So in some senses, it's almost like the clay and the potter. The clay is light because all matter is literally a frozen light. And the potter is the logos, the sound that forms it on the potter's wheel into whatever he chooses to make. And life then is the product of the clay and the potter, of the logos and of the light. So even at the very beginning of John's gospel, we are told, in the beginning was the logos, in the beginning was the word, and the word was with God, and the word was God, and the word became flesh and dwelt among us. So it is the word or the sound or the vibration or the frequency, you can give it any term you want, dancing with light that actually gives form and morphology and taxonomy to all of light. So for me, that's how life emerges from God. That's my second point. My third point then is what happens on the way back. And so in some senses, initially evolution is a kind of an unconscious process. There's an interior program, a divinely guided program, aided and abetted by information from the sunlight that drives this evolutionary trajectory forward. But at some stage, a species comes into existence which is capable of becoming self-aware. the self-conscious, and more importantly, it can take control of further evolution. So now we have the evolution of consciousness giving birth to conscious evolution, an evolution that can now be driven in various ways by thinking beings. And this is a very, very dangerous stage of a transition. The transition from evolution of consciousness into conscious evolution now means that there are beings who have free will and technology. And it means that when you have free will and technology, but you're not very spiritually aligned, you can drive this life form to extinction. And that's part of our danger in our planet right now. That we have free will, we have technology, but our sense of spirit and our sense of mysticism is totally lacking. And certainly when you look at the world around us, technology and science in various ways, spirit is being killed, God is being killed so often in modern society. And we're attempting to drive this machine of conscious evolution over the cliff into the abyss. It's going to take mystics to avert that disaster. And that's the difference for me between wisdom and knowledge. Wisdom, for me, is information which is generated by the soul and processed by the heart. Whereas knowledge is simply information that's generated by the senses and processed by the brain. And very, very often, knowledge, a little knowledge, is a very dangerous thing. If knowledge doesn't morph into wisdom, then very quickly free will and technology will drive our species into extinction. There are two models of survival of the fittest, I believe. I call one of them the paleo survival, the old version of survival, and this was hypervigilance and violence to get control or be in charge of resources. That was the old style of survival of the fittest, and maybe at some stage of the evolution of our planet that may have been necessary. But now there's a neo-survival. It's the survival of those who operate out of serenity, who are aligned with their inner spirit, and who are aligned with compassion and forgiveness of others. That is what will survive. That is the only part of the human experiment that will survive. Only those who are aligned with that level of the self and of God have the ability to take our world beyond the crisis in which we find ourselves right now. And so when I look at the story of God initially, it's a story of devolution from God to holographic fractals to bite-sized pieces of self, right down to us becoming self-aware, self-conscious, and driving evolution. That I would call devolution. It's getting denser and denser and denser. The journey back is real evolution. And I'm totally convinced that real evolution begins with laughter. Laughter is the end of Maya. Laughter is the end of the illusion of the world we think is real. Laughter, I believe, is the antechamber to compassion. And it leads into an awe-filled silence at the mystery of God. And the laughter goes in 3 stages. When I wake up and I'm on the road to enlightenment, the first indicator is I can laugh at myself. And it's not that I think I'm stupid. It's just that I realize I've been sold a bill of goods. That every culture, creates children and an educational system and a political system and an industrial system and religious systems which are, cult-based or sectarian by nature, in which there's an outsider and an insider. And so when you finally see through that illusion, you begin to laugh at yourself. And I just wonder how many of us at COJ, who've come particularly from Roman Catholic backgrounds, how many times in your lifetime have you had the courage or the opportunity to laugh at what you were made to believe? Can you really believe at this stage that if you eat sausage on a Friday, you're going to go to hell for all eternity? Or that if you miss Mass on a Sunday, you're going to go to hell for all eternity? Or that if you happen to be born Protestant or Hindu or whatever, you can never get to heaven? How many of the old doctrines have you had to shed? How many times have you had to laugh at yourself and what you took to be the truth? That's the start of the enlightenment process. The next stage of laughter is beginning to laugh at others. And this is not derisive laughter. This is just the realization that large parts of our world are still stuck in illusions. And they're sectarian illusions. But it's a laughter that I've used this example before. The laughter of a parent when she sees a little toddler falling as is attempting to learn to walk. The parent isn't laughing at the clumsiness of the child. The parent is laughing because the parent realizes the child is learning how to walk and the child will walk. We have to learn to laugh at others then, not because out of sectarian understanding, but because we want everybody to wake up to who they really are and to stop taking sides, partisan politics, partisan religion, partisan belief systems that divide us from each other until we get to see through who the other person really is. And then finally we can laugh at the world. We can laugh at this extraordinary illusion. We can laugh at our geological history, the stories we've been told about, how things proceeded. The stories that would have us believe that there were never other civilizations before us, that we're the apex, that the human species, our planet Earth never produced anything greater than us, or that the entire cosmos never produced anything greater than Homo sapiens sapiens on this little planet. Then we can laugh at that and realize that we live in a cosmos which is far vaster and far more beautiful than the version of Earth that we've created. Laughter is the beginning of that. Really deep belly laughter. Rather than celebrating Pyrrhic victories of whatever kind, it's laughter at the illusions we're being invited to break through. There's this great Zen Buddhist koan that says, what is the sound of one hand clapping? I would say to you today, what is the sound of one mystic laughing? That's where the future is. That's where evolution lies. So if I were to try to pull all these ideas together, I see that this evolution, devolution goes through kind of 5 main stages. In the first stage, there is only God. The isness, the God who is, who knows herself, and who loves whom she finds herself to be. That's stage 1, God alone. Stage 2 is God manifests or God creates, in some senses, creates holographic fractals of the self, bite-sized pieces of herself, nets so it seem, sparks of light. The third one is that this creation then becomes self-aware, and I'm using self-aware with a little s right there. So flora arrive and fauna arrive, and even Homo sapiens arrive where they're self-aware. Plants are self-aware. They know how to reach for sunlight. They know how to pick nutrients from the soil and ignore that which they don't want. Animals are self-aware. They know how to avoid danger. They know how to feed. But very, very often, this level of self-awareness only has 2 agendas: survival and reproduction. And in fact, that's the scientific definition of life. A species is alive if it's concerned with survival and self-reproduction. That's the model of self-awareness. There's a 4th stage where creation becomes self-aware with a capital S. And I'm going to call this level, I'm going to invent a new term today, I will call it Homo mysticus. And this is a creation which has become aware of its own divinity, and ipso facto, the divinity of all else that is. And instead of just being concerned with survival and reproduction, it's concerned with unity consciousness and unconditional love. That's what Homo mysticus is going to look like. And so as I look at it, the journey back to God, which I call evolution, is the reversal of the journey from God, which I call devolution. And so the journey back to God is a reversal of how God evolved. So there was the isness of God, then there was God's total self-knowledge, and then there was the love that God had for whom she found herself to be. So in some senses, to make stage there, the isness of God, the self-knowledge of God, and the self-love of God. Now, the last 3 stages on the way back to God, I believe, go in exactly the reverse order. Instead of being, knowing, and loving, there is loving, knowing, and being. Most of us believe that I can't love somebody unless I first know them. I say to you, you can't know somebody until you first love them. Because people are not free to be who they are until they're being loved unconditionally. And until you know who you are, you can't truly be who you are. If you don't love others, you'll never know them. And if you don't know yourself, you can't be who you're meant to be. So who do you think that you are? If you get the answers to that question right, if you really know who you are, then ipso facto, you know who your neighbor is, and you know what your mission is, and you know who God is. Bon voyage, my companions on the journey.